Our Parsha includes the commandment to build a Mishkan, or a tabernacle for God. The Torah tells us, "V'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham," and let them make a sanctuary, that I may dwell among them. But how can a physical structure become a dwelling place for God? Rashi explains about this pasuk, "V'asu lishmi beit kedusha." Let them make for me a house of holiness. According to Rashi, if a structure is built solely as a place where man will go to encounter God, to worship God, then that structure can become a house of holiness, a place that God can dwell in. The way in which the raw materials for the Mishkan were gathered is quite different and unique if we compare it with how the materials for the first Beit HaMikdash or the second Beit HaMikdash were accumulated. The materials for the Mishkan were gathered from freely brought in gifts of the Jewish people. The very beginning of our Parsha, it says, "Tell the Jewish people to bring me gifts. You shall accept gifts from me, from every person whose heart so moves them." And the Torah goes on to list all of the materials that were gathered in this manner. The Mishkan is also unique because it wasn't just a place where God was worshipped, where sacrifices were brought. Instead, it was also really a place where man went to encounter God, to hear God's voice. The pasuk in Bamidbar explains that when Moshe went into the tent of meeting to speak with him, he would hear the voice addressing him from above the cover that was on top of the ark of the pact between the two cherubim. Thus he spoke to him. And the Mefarshim explained that God's voice actually couldn't be heard outside the Mishkan. Only within the Mishkan could God's voice be heard. The Mishkan is also unique and different from the Beit HaMikdash that stood in Yerushalayim because it was a holy space. The Beit HaMikdash in Yerushalayim was both a holy space, but it was also, its holiness was also about its place, Har HaBayit, the place where the Beit HaMikdash, where the temple stood in Yerushalayim, is still a holy place, even though, of course, the Beit HaMikdash is no longer there. In contrast, the Mishkan could be built anywhere. In fact, it was, of course, moved around as the Jewish people moved in the Midbar. Its holiness was tied to its physical space, but not to the particular location where it was in. And in that way, it's much more reminiscent of the synagogues that we have today. A shul, of course, can be anywhere. Its holiness is about its space, not its physical location. A synagogue also, like the Mishkan, can be thought of as a Beit Kedusha, a house of holiness. But what does that word really mean? Let's listen to a talk that Rav Soloveitchik gave in 1972 about the nature of a shul to flesh out that idea a little bit more. The recording is old and not in the best condition, so we'll also read a summary of a piece of this talk afterwards.
I remember as a little child, I was raised in a Chabad town. There was a synagogue, it's called the Alte Chassidic Shul. There was a tradition as the founder of Chabad, Balatanya, the Zalman, Shnei Zalman, once studied in that shul. Because there was one seat, completely fenced, no one could sit down. Because this was the seat on which he sat. When he crossed Chaslavich with the Russian army which was pursued by Napoleon. So I remember the population of Chaslavich consisted not of millionaires, I don't have to tell you that. Not even of wealth, of rich, and not even of people who are comfortable. Poor people, workers, tradesmen, particularly peddlers, who used to travel and visit the villages, within a 50-mile radius from the town of Chaslavich. And you cannot imagine, the primitive conditions and the circumstances under which the Russian peasants lived, shall I say, 50 or 55 years ago. And I remember Friday late afternoon, I used to come to school early, and I used to watch the people coming in one by one, with water rinsing from their head, from their face and beards, because they were immersed in the mikveh. And immediately, beginning to rub their hands, וידעו השם תתנו חזנים ולגו ביד השם השגור ויעצור והרוד הסקיפתם ממזרח ומערב ומתפריון. They sang the hymn of gratitude to God for what? For delivery from captivity, for freeing people from the prison, for freedom and return. You felt the people, clean to God, and they came home. In spite of the fact we knew very well that next day, 72 minutes after sunset, they'll return to the peasants, to the ignorant primitive peasants in the villages surrounding it.
This talk was given by Rav Soloveitchik in 1972 at Congregation Kehillah Jeshurun in New York, and Rabbi Haskell Lookstein, now the Rabbi Emeritus at that shul, wrote up a summary of it. And the Rav says, why do we need a synagogue at all? Why not pray in a field? The Jew does not need a house in which to pray. He does not even need a minyan for prayer. We need a structure, not for its architectural value, but for its psychological effect. We do not need a house. We need a home. The synagogue should not be called the house of God, but rather, or more accurately, the home of man. The Jewish peasants that the Rav described in the piece from the recording that we just heard, they felt intensely that a shul was their home because it was a place in which they could encounter God, where they felt shelter and protection, no matter what had been going on to them or what they had had to endure during the week, even if that protection was only fleeting. The synagogue, he continues, exists as an institution and as an idea. As an institution, it is and does many things. As an idea, as a representation of an ideal in the Jewish religion, the synagogue is the home of man, man's refuge from the insecurity and vulnerability of exile. And he concludes the synagogue as an idea represents man's home on earth. And they shall build for me a sanctuary, and I shall dwell in their midst. The synagogue is God's home because it is man's home. When we appreciate and recognize that a shul is a place of refuge for us from the insecurities and the challenges that we face, then also it will certainly be a place that is God's home and a place in which we can fully encounter God's presence. Shabbat Shalom.